In the summer of 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged overhead and London burned beneath the Luftwaffe's relentless assault, a young German pilot plummeted from the sky in flames. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 spiraled earthward, trailing black smoke across the Kent countryside. When Home Guard volunteers pulled him from the wreckage, his face was unrecognizable, a mass of charred flesh and blistered skin. The attending physician at East Grinstead's Queen Victoria Hospital gave him days to live, perhaps hours. Blindness was certain if he survived at all. But what happened next would not only save this enemy airman's life, it would revolutionize burn treatment forever, transform thousands of Allied lives, and become one of Britain's most closely guarded medical secrets. The German High Command would spend years trying to understand why their captured pilots returned from British captivity with faces rebuilt, sight restored, and stories of a miracle that defied every principle of wartime medicine they knew. The summer of 1940 descended upon Britain like a biblical plague. Each morning, the sun rose over a nation bracing for annihilation. From the white cliffs of Dover to the industrial heartlands of Manchester, from the Scottish Highlands to the Welsh valleys, every man, woman and child understood that invasion was no longer a question of if, but when. The Luftwaffe's Adlerangriff, Eagle attack, had begun in earnest on August 13th, and the skies above southern England had become a furnace where young men burned. At RAF Fighter Command Headquarters in Bentley Priory, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding studied the plotting tables with the grim expression of a man watching his resources hemorrhage. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Britain possessed approximately 650 operational fighters. Germany fielded over 2,600 aircraft, but numbers told only part of the story. The true crisis was not aircraft. British factories working round the clock under the tireless direction of Lord Beaverbrook's Ministry of Aircraft Production were churning out Spitfires and Hurricanes at a remarkable rate. The crisis was pilots. "We're losing them faster than we can train replacements," Dowding confided to his staff during a late-night briefing in mid-August. His voice carried the weight of a man who knew every name, every face of the boys he was sending into the meat grinder. And it's not just the dead. For every pilot killed, 2 more are burned so badly they'll never fly again. The statistics were horrifying. Of the RAF pilots shot down and surviving the initial crash, over 60% suffered severe burns, primarily to the face and hands. The Hawker Hurricane, despite its legendary status, had a fuel tank positioned directly in front of the pilot. When hit by German cannon fire, it transformed into a flying inferno. Pilots had seconds to bail out, and in those seconds, the flames found exposed skin. The Spitfire was marginally better, but not by much. At Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead, a small market town 30 miles south of London, a New Zealand-born surgeon named Archibald Mackindoe was confronting this crisis firsthand. Mackindoe, 40 years old, had been appointed consultant in plastic surgery to the RAF in 1938, a position that seemed almost quaint before the war. Plastic surgery was then considered a cosmetic luxury, the domain of wealthy women seeking facelifts. But Mackindoe had trained under the legendary Harold Gillies, who had pioneered reconstructive surgery during the Great War, and he understood that war would once again demand innovation in the repair of shattered bodies. What Mackindoe encountered in the summer of 1940 exceeded his darkest imaginings. The first Hurricane pilot arrived on August 16th, Flight Lieutenant James Edmonds, 23 years old, from Cheltenham. His aircraft had been hit during a dogfight over Maidstone. The glycol coolant system ruptured, spraying superheated liquid across the cockpit. Edmonds managed to bail out at 8,000 feet, but by then his face, hands and neck were already cooking beneath his leather flying helmet and gloves. When the parachute deployed, the sudden deceleration tore away the melted fabric, exposing raw flesh to the 200-mile-per-hour slipstream. Mackindoe examined him in the hospital's makeshift burns unit, formerly a tuberculosis ward, hastily converted as casualties mounted. Edmonds was conscious, which was almost worse. His eyelids were burned away entirely. His nose was a blackened stump. His lips had fused to his teeth. His hands resembled charred claws. "Can you save my eyes?" Edmonds whispered through the wreckage of his mouth. McIndoe had no answer. The standard treatment for severe burns in 1940 was tannic acid, a substance derived from tree bark that formed a hard, leather-like coating over the wound. The theory was that this coating would protect against infection. In practice, it was medieval. The tannic acid caused the burned tissue to contract violently, pulling skin tight across the skull, sealing eyelids shut permanently, curling fingers into useless hooks. Worse, when the time came to remove the coating for skin grafts, the process was agonizing and often caused more damage than the original burn. "We'll do everything we can," McIndoe replied, but his mind was already racing toward a heretical conclusion. Everything they were doing was wrong. By September, Queen Victoria Hospital was receiving an average of 4 burned airmen per day. McIndoe's Ward Through, which the patients had grimly nicknamed the Guinea Pig Club, was filled with young men wrapped in tannic acid cocoons, their faces frozen in permanent screams, their hands useless, their eyes sealed shut. The mortality rate was approaching 40%. Of those who survived, fewer than 1 in 10 would ever return to normal life. Most faced a future of blindness, disfigurement, and chronic pain. McIndoe began to question everything. He observed that pilots who crashed into the English Channel and were rescued quickly, their burns washed by salt water, healed better than those treated immediately with tannic acid. He noticed that wounds left open to the air, kept moist and clean, showed less infection than those sealed beneath chemical coatings. He read obscure medical journals from Scandinavia describing the use of saline baths for burn treatment. He consulted with his cousin, Sir Harold Gillies, who shared his skepticism of conventional methods. But the medical establishment was not interested in the theories of a colonial upstart. The Royal Army Medical Corps had used tannic acid since the Great War. It was doctrine. It was proven. To suggest otherwise was to invite accusations of quackery or worse, undermining the war effort. Then in late September, everything changed. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 was shot down over Ashford by squadron leader Peter Townsend of 85 Squadron. The pilot, Oberleutnant Franz Bergmann, 26 years old, from Munich, bailed out at low altitude. His parachute barely deployed before he hit the ground in a farmer's field. Home Guard volunteers found him unconscious, his flight suit still smoldering. His face was burned beyond recognition. His hands were blackened stumps. His eyelids were gone. They brought him to Queen Victoria Hospital because it was the nearest facility equipped to handle severe burns. When McIndoe examined him, he saw the same horrific injuries he'd been treating for months. But this time, something was different. This time, the patient was the enemy. McIndoe stood in the examination room, staring at the unconscious German pilot, and made a decision that would alter the course of medical history. He would not use tannic acid. He would not follow the standard protocol. He would try something new, something radical, and he would use this enemy airman as his first test case. "Prepare a saline bath," he told his head nurse, Sister Hall, "and send word to the pharmacy. I need them to compound a new salve, petroleum jelly base, sulfonamide powder, and cod liver oil. I want it ready within the hour." Sister Hall stared at him. "Sir, the protocol—" "Damn the protocol," McIndoe said quietly. "The protocol is killing them. All of them, British, German, it doesn't matter. They're all burning and we're letting them die because we're too bloody stubborn to admit we're wrong." He looked down at Franz Bergmann's ruined face. "This man tried to kill us. His bombs have murdered our civilians. By every right we should let him die in agony, but we won't, because we're British, and because if we can save him, if this works, we can save our own boys too." The decision was made. The experiment would begin. And neither McIndoe nor anyone else in that room could have imagined that this moment, This choice to show mercy to an enemy would become one of Britain's greatest weapons in the war to come. The saline bath was ready by midnight. Mackindoe had commandeered the hospital's hydrotherapy room, a relic from the building's pre-war days as a convalescent facility for tuberculosis patients. The room was tiled in white ceramic, with a large porcelain tub in the center and overhead lamps that cast harsh, clinical light across every surface. It smelled of disinfectant and coal smoke from the boiler room below. Franz Bergmann remained unconscious as orderlies carefully transferred him from the examination table to a wheeled stretcher. His breathing was shallow and labored. Mackindoe had administered morphine, enough to keep him under for the initial treatment, but not so much that it would suppress his respiratory system further. Burns of this severity often led to shock, and shock killed as surely as infection. Sister Hall had assembled a team of 3 nurses, all volunteers, all aware that what they were about to do violated every standard protocol in the British medical establishment. If this went wrong, if the patient died, Mackindoe would face a court of inquiry. His career would be finished, but if it went right. Temperature? Mackindoe asked, testing the water with his hand. 37 degrees Celsius, sir. Body temperature, as you specified. Good. Let's begin. They lowered Bergmann into the bath slowly, supporting his head above the waterline. The moment the saline solution touched his burned flesh, his body convulsed. Even unconscious, the nervous system registered the contact. Mackindoe watched carefully, monitoring the pilot's pulse, his breathing, the color of what remained of his skin. He's stabilizing, Sister Hall reported after 5 minutes. Pulse is steadying. Mackindoe nodded. The first hurdle was cleared. The saline wasn't causing additional shock. Now came the delicate part, cleaning the wounds without causing further damage. For the next 2 hours, Mackindoe and his team worked with painstaking precision. Using soft gauze and gentle irrigation, they removed the charred fabric embedded in Bergmann's flesh, fragments of his Luftwaffe flight suit, pieces of leather gloves, melted rubber from his oxygen mask. Each piece had to be extracted carefully to avoid tearing away viable tissue beneath. It was archaeological work, layer by layer, revealing the extent of the devastation. The burns covered approximately 40% of Bergmann's body. His face was the worst. 3rd-degree burns across the forehead, cheeks, and chin. His nose was partially destroyed. His eyelids were burned away completely, leaving the eyeballs exposed and vulnerable. His hands were nearly as bad, the palms and fingers blackened. The skin split open in deep fissures that exposed muscle and tendon beneath. "Jesus Christ," one of the nurses whispered. "Focus," Mackindoe said sharply. "We're not here to gawk. We're here to save him." By 2 a.m. the cleaning was complete. Bergmann lay in the bath, his wounds exposed, raw and weeping. Under the old protocol, this was the moment when tannic acid would be applied, painted across the burns in thick coats until a hard shell formed. Instead, Mackindoe reached for the jar of Salve that the hospital pharmacy had prepared according to his specifications. The mixture was simple: petroleum jelly as a base to keep the wounds moist and protected, sulfonamide powder to fight infection, and cod liver oil rich in vitamins A and D to promote healing. It looked unremarkable, a pale yellow cream with a faint fishy smell, but Mackindoe believed it represented a fundamental shift in burn treatment philosophy. Instead of sealing the wound and letting it heal beneath a rigid barrier, this approach would keep the tissue flexible, moist, and open to the air. It would allow the body's natural healing processes to work without interference. "Apply it gently," Mackindoe instructed, "a thin layer across all the burned areas. Don't rub, just spread it like butter on bread." The nurses worked in silence, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. As the salve made contact with Bergmann's exposed flesh, something remarkable happened. The angry redness of the burns seemed to diminish slightly. The weeping slowed. The tissue, which had been contracting and tightening, appeared to relax. "Sir," Sister Hall said quietly, "look at his hands." Mackindoe leaned closer. Bergman's fingers, which had been curling into claws as the burned tissue contracted, were straightening slightly. The salve was preventing the immediate contracture that made tannic acid treatment so devastating. "Extraordinary," McIndoe murmured. "It's actually working." They lifted Bergman from the bath and transferred him to a bed in the isolation ward, a small room at the end of Ward the Third, separated from the other patients by a glass partition. McIndoe wanted to monitor him closely without exposing him to potential infection from other patients or allowing the British airmen to see their enemy receiving treatment. The next challenge was the eyes. With no eyelids to protect them, Bergman's eyeballs were exposed to air, light, and potential infection. Under normal circumstances, this would lead to rapid corneal damage and permanent blindness within days. McIndoe had anticipated this problem. He'd prepared special gauze pads soaked in the same saline solution, which he now placed gently over Bergman's eyes, securing them with soft bandages that wrapped around the pilot's head. "Change these every 4 hours," he instructed Sister Hall. "Keep them moist. The eyes must not dry out." "Yes, sir. And the salve. Reapply twice daily, morning and evening. And I want detailed notes on every observation. Temperature, pulse, appearance of the wounds, any signs of infection, any changes in tissue color or texture. Everything." McIndoe stepped back and looked at his patient. Franz Bergman lay motionless, his body wrapped in gauze and salve, his face barely recognizable as human. The morphine would wear off in a few hours, and then the real test would begin. Would he survive the night? Would infection set in? Would the treatment prove to be nothing more than wishful thinking? "Get some rest," McIndoe told his team. "We'll know more in the morning." But McIndoe himself didn't rest. He returned to his office and began writing detailed notes on the procedure, documenting every step, every decision, every observation. If this worked, if Bergman survived and healed, McIndoe would need to present his findings to the Royal Army Medical Corps. He would need evidence, data, proof that his method was superior to the established protocol. And if it didn't work, if Bergman died, then McIndoe would have to live with the knowledge that he'd experimented on a helpless patient, enemy or not, and failed. Dawn broke over East Grinstead at 6:47 a.m. on September 28, 1940. The town was waking to another day of war, another day of rationing, of air raid sirens, of uncertainty. In Ward the Third of Queen Victoria Hospital, Sister Hall was changing Franz Bergman's eye dressings when she noticed something that made her heart skip. "Dr. McIndoe!" she called urgently. "You need to see this!" McIndoe arrived within minutes, still wearing yesterday's surgical gown, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "What is it?" Sister Hall pointed to Bergman's face. "The swelling, sir. It's reduced. Significantly." McIndoe leaned in close, examining the burned tissue with a practiced eye. She was right. The massive edema that had distorted Bergman's features the night before had diminished noticeably. The tissue looked less angry, less inflamed, and more importantly, there was no sign of the blackening that indicated necrosis, dead tissue that would have to be surgically removed. "Check his temperature," McIndoe ordered. "Already done, sir. 37.2 degrees. Normal. Pulse. 72. Strong and steady." McIndoe felt a surge of cautious optimism. Bergman had survived the night. His body wasn't rejecting the treatment. The infection that killed so many burn victims in the first 48 hours hadn't materialized. It was too early to declare victory, but it was a promising start. "Continue the protocol," McIndoe said, "and send word to the pharmacy. I want enough of that salve prepared for 10 patients. We're going to need it." Over the next 3 days, Franz Bergman's condition continued to improve. The burns began to show signs of healing, new tissue forming at the edges, the raw flesh gradually covering with a thin layer of pink skin. His hands, which McIndoe had feared would be permanently crippled, retained their flexibility. The fingers could be gently manipulated without the resistance that characterized tannic acid contracture. But the most remarkable development came on the 4th day, when Bergman regained consciousness. Mackindo was at his bedside when the German pilot's eyes fluttered open beneath the gauze pads. Bergman tried to speak, but his throat was raw from smoke inhalation and intubation. Mackindo held up a hand. "Don't try to talk yet," he said in German, a language he'd learned during his medical training in Berlin before the war. "You're in a British hospital. You were shot down. You're badly burned, but you're alive." Bergman's eyes, visible through gaps in the bandages, widened with fear and confusion. He tried to raise his hands to his face, but Mackindo gently restrained him. "Your face and hands are injured," Mackindo continued. "We're treating you with a new method. You're going to survive, Oberleutnant Bergman, and if all goes well, you'll keep your sight." Tears began to flow from Bergman's eyes, not from pain, but from the overwhelming realization that he was alive, that he wasn't blind, that the enemy who had every reason to let him die was instead fighting to save him. "Warum?" Bergman whispered hoarsely. "Why?" Mackindo considered the question, considered the eye. Why indeed? Why save an enemy pilot when British boys were dying for lack of resources? Why risk his career on an experimental treatment? Why show mercy to a man who had come to kill? "Because we're doctors," Mackindo replied simply. "And because you're going to help us save a lot of lives, British lives. Your suffering is going to mean something." He didn't tell Bergman the full truth, that he was the first test case, the proof of concept, the guinea pig for a treatment that Mackindo hoped would revolutionize burn care. That would come later. For now, it was enough that the German pilot was alive, healing, and beginning to understand that he'd become part of something larger than the war itself. By the end of the first week, Mackindo had enough data to present his findings to the hospital's medical board. The results were undeniable. Bergman's burns were healing faster and cleaner than any case treated with tannic acid. There was no infection, no necrosis, no contracture. The tissue remained flexible and viable. And most remarkably, Bergman's eyes, despite having no eyelids to protect them, showed no signs of corneal damage. "I want authorization to use this treatment on our own pilots," Mackindo told the board. Immediately, the senior physicians exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Doctor." Reginald Pound, the hospital's chief of medicine, cleared his throat. "Archibald, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but you've conducted this experiment on a single patient, a German patient, I might add. The sample size is insufficient. The Royal Army Medical Corps has decades of experience with tannic acid treatment. We can't simply abandon established protocol based on one case. One case that's succeeding where dozens have failed." Mackindo shot back. "Gentlemen, I have 17 British pilots in Ward 3 right now. 17 boys who are going to be blind, crippled, or dead within a month if we continue with tannic acid. I'm asking, no, I'm begging, for permission to try something different." "And if it fails," Pound asked, "if these boys die because you abandoned proven methods?" "They're dying anyway!" Mackindo's voice rose with frustration. "Don't you understand? The proven methods don't work. They've never worked. We've just been too stubborn or too frightened to admit it." The room fell silent. Finally, Dr. Edward Blaxell, the hospital's senior surgeon, spoke. "I'll support you, Archie. On one condition. You start with the worst cases, the ones we've already written off. If your treatment saves them, we'll expand it. But if they die, you stop immediately and return to standard protocol." "Agreed." Mackindo nodded. "Agreed." That afternoon, he began treating his first British patient with the new Salve. Pilot Officer Richard Hillary, 21 years old, shot down over the Thames estuary on September 3rd. Hillary's hands were burned so badly that the tannic acid had fused his fingers together into solid masses. His face was a mask of contracted scar tissue. He was blind in one eye and losing vision in the other. Mackindo removed the tannic acid coating, a process that took 3 agonizing hours and left Hillary screaming despite morphine. Then he immersed the young pilot in a saline bath and applied the salve. "This is going to hurt," Mackindo told him honestly. "But I believe it's going to save your hands, and possibly your sight." Do you trust me? Hilary, his voice barely a whisper through his damaged throat, replied with the dry humor that would later make him famous as an author. Do I have a choice, sir? Not really, no. Then I suppose I trust you. Over the next 2 weeks, Mackindo treated 6 more British pilots with his new method. The results were consistent and remarkable. Wounds healed faster. Infection rates dropped to nearly 0. Contracture was minimal. And most importantly, pilots who had been facing certain blindness began to regain their vision as their eyelids slowly regenerated. Word spread through Ward III, the Guinea Pig Club, as the patients had nicknamed themselves. The boys who'd been treated with tannic acid watched with a mixture of hope and envy as their comrades, treated with Mackindo's Salve, showed dramatic improvement. Some demanded to be switched to the new treatment. Others, their bodies already ruined by contracture, could only watch and wonder what might have been. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. In early October, Franz Bergmann was well enough to be transferred to a prisoner of war camp. Before he left, Mackindo examined him one final time. The burns had healed remarkably well. New skin covered most of the damaged areas. His hands were functional, not perfect, but capable of gripping, writing, and performing basic tasks. And his eyes, against all odds, had survived intact. He would need reconstructive surgery eventually. New eyelids, a rebuilt nose, skin grafts to smooth the scarring. But he was alive, functional, and sighted. "You've given me my life back," Bergman said in halting English. "I don't understand why, but thank you." Mackindo shook his hand carefully, mindful of the healing tissue. "Write to your family when you get to the camp. Tell them you're alive. And Oberleutnant, when this war is over, come back and see me. I'll finish the job properly." Bergman never made it to the POW camp. His transport was intercepted by MI6 officers who had been monitoring the case with intense interest. They had questions, many questions, about the treatment, about his recovery, about what he'd seen and heard in Ward 3, and they had a proposal, one that would turn Franz Bergmann from a prisoner of war into one of Britain's most valuable intelligence assets and transform Mackindo's medical innovation into a weapon of psychological warfare that would haunt the German High Command for the rest of the war. The interrogation room in the basement of the War Office building on Whitehall was deliberately austere. Bare walls, a single table, 2 chairs, and a lamp that cast harsh shadows across the faces of those who sat beneath it. Franz Bergmann sat on one side, still wearing his hospital-issue pajamas beneath a borrowed RAF greatcoat. Across from him sat Major Thomas Kendrick of MI6, a man whose mild appearance, round spectacles, thinning hair, the demeanor of a provincial schoolmaster, concealed one of the sharpest intelligence minds in Britain. "Tell me again about the treatment," Kendrick said, his voice gentle but insistent. "Every detail you can remember." Bergman had already told the story 3 times, but he told it again. The saline bath, the strange salve that smelled of fish oil, the absence of the tannic acid he'd been trained to expect, the daily applications, the gradual healing, the preservation of his sight. "And the other patients?" Kendrick asked. "The British pilots, were they receiving the same treatment?" "Some of them, yes, the newer ones. The Dr. Mackindo, he was very excited about it. He kept taking photographs, making notes. He said it was revolutionary." Kendrick leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Oberleutnant Bergmann, I'm going to be frank with you. What you've described is medically impossible according to everything we know about burn treatment. Yet here you sit with functional hands and working eyes, when by all rights you should be blind and crippled. This presents us with an interesting opportunity." "I don't understand." "You're going to be repatriated," Kendrick said. "Through the Red Cross. Severe medical cases are sometimes exchanged. It's one of the few civilized aspects of this uncivilized war. You'll be sent back to Germany within the month." Bergman's eyes widened. "But why? I'm a prisoner. I have intelligence value." "You have far more value to us in Germany than you do here," Kendrick replied, because when you arrive home, when your Luftwaffe doctors examine you and see what we've done, they're going to have questions. Questions they can't answer. And that, Oberleutnant, is worth more than any tactical intelligence you might possess. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Bergman would be returned to Germany as part of a medical exchange, along with detailed but deliberately incomplete medical records documenting his treatment. The records would show the remarkable results, but would omit key details about the salve's composition and application method. The Germans would see that Britain had developed a revolutionary burn treatment, but they wouldn't know how to replicate it. "What do you want from me?" Bergman asked. "Nothing," Kendrick said. "Just be honest. Tell your doctors everything you experienced. Show them your hands, your face, your eyes. Let them see what British medicine can do. And then we wait." Bergman was repatriated on November 12, 1940, along with 6 other severely wounded German prisoners. He arrived at Tempelhof Airport in Berlin on a cold, grey afternoon, stepping off a Red Cross transport plane into a world that had changed dramatically in the 2 months since he'd been shot down. The Luftwaffe's assault on Britain had failed. The invasion had been postponed indefinitely, and the German High Command was desperately trying to understand why. Bergman was taken immediately to the Luftwaffe Medical Institute in Berlin-Charlottenburg, where he was examined by Dr. Friedrich Hesse, one of Germany's leading experts in aviation medicine. Hesse's initial assessment was clinical and detached, until he examined Bergman's hands. "This is impossible," Hesse muttered, turning Bergman's hands over in his own, studying the healed tissue, the flexible fingers, the minimal scarring. "Burns of this severity should have resulted in complete contracture. Your hands should be useless. How is this possible?" "The British have a new treatment," Bergman explained. "A salve. They applied it twice daily, kept the wounds moist, used saline baths, no tannic acid." Hesse's expression shifted from confusion to skepticism. "No tannic acid? That's absurd. Tannic acid is the standard treatment. It's been proven effective since the Great War." "With respect, Herr Doctor, I don't think it has been proven effective. I saw British pilots in the hospital who'd been treated with tannic acid. They were blind, crippled, dying. The ones treated with the new method, they were healing, walking. Some were even talking about returning to flight duty." Hesse said nothing, but his mind was racing. He'd treated dozens of Luftwaffe pilots with severe burns over the past year. The survival rate was approximately 30%. Of those who survived, fewer than 10% ever returned to active duty. Most were medically discharged, their bodies too damaged to be of further use to the Reich. If the British had truly developed a superior treatment, the implications were staggering. "I need to see your medical records," Hesse said. The records arrived from the Red Cross 2 days later. Hesse studied them with increasing frustration. They documented the treatment protocol in general terms: saline baths, topical application of an unspecified salve, regular wound cleaning, absence of tannic acid, but provided no details about the salve's composition. The photographs were even more maddening. They showed Bergman's progression from near death to recovery in stark detail, but they raised more questions than they answered. Hesse presented his findings to a meeting of the Luftwaffe Medical Corps on November 20th. The room was filled with senior physicians, all of them veterans of the Great War, all of them trained in the same methods, all of them deeply skeptical of anything that challenged established doctrine. "Gentlemen," Hesse began, "we have a problem. The British appear to have developed a burn treatment that is significantly superior to our own. I have examined a repatriated pilot whose recovery defies every principle of burn medicine we currently practice." He displayed the photographs of Bergman's hands, before and after. The contrast was undeniable. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the room. "This is propaganda," declared Dr. Otto Bickenbach, a senior medical officer and ardent Nazi Party member. "The British are trying to demoralize us with false claims of medical superiority. It's psychological warfare, nothing more. I've examined the patient personally, Hesse countered. His recovery is real. His hands are functional. His eyes are intact. This is not propaganda. It's medical fact. Then how do you explain it? Bickenbach demanded. If this treatment is so revolutionary, why haven't we heard of it before? Why isn't it documented in medical literature? Because it's new, Hesse said. Developed specifically for this war, for these injuries. And the British are keeping it secret because they know it gives them an advantage. The room erupted in argument. Some physicians were intrigued, demanding more information, more evidence. Others were dismissive, clinging to the familiar certainty of tannic acid treatment. A few were openly hostile, viewing Hesse's claims as defeatist or even treasonous. The debate reached the desk of Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, within days. Göring, already under intense pressure from Hitler over the failure of the Battle of Britain, was in no mood for medical mysteries. He summoned Hesse to his office at the Reich Air Ministry. "Explain to me," Göring said, his voice dangerously quiet, "why British medicine is superior to German medicine. I was under the impression that we were the master race, Herr Doctor, that our science, our technology, our medicine were the finest in the world. Was I misinformed?" Hesse chose his words carefully. "Reichsmarschall, the British have developed a specific treatment for a specific problem. It doesn't mean their medicine is superior overall. It means they've innovated in one area where we have not." "Then innovate," Göring roared. "Find out what they're doing and replicate it. I'm losing pilots faster than I can replace them, and you're telling me the British have a way to save them, and we don't? This is unacceptable." Hesse left the meeting with orders to develop a German equivalent of the British burn treatment within 3 months. It was an impossible deadline, but in the Third Reich, impossible was not an acceptable answer. The Luftwaffe Medical Corps began a frantic research program. They experimented with different salve compositions, petroleum jelly, lanolin, beeswax, various oils and antibiotics. They tried saline baths, freshwater baths, no baths at all. They tested on animals, on cadavers, and eventually on living patients. Luftwaffe pilots with severe burns who became unwitting subjects in a desperate race to match British capabilities. Nothing worked as well as the tannic acid alternative the British had developed. The German salves either caused infections, failed to prevent contracture, or simply didn't promote healing. The saline baths helped, but without the right topical treatment, they were insufficient. Pilot after pilot died or was permanently disabled while German doctors struggled to understand what the British had discovered. Meanwhile, intelligence reports from other repatriated prisoners began to filter back to Berlin. Each report told the same story. British burn treatment was remarkably effective. Pilots who should have died were surviving. Pilots who should have been blind were seeing. Pilots who should have been crippled were regaining function. And all of them spoke of a miracle salve and a New Zealand surgeon named Mackindo who was performing medical magic at a hospital in East Grinstead. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, was tasked with finding out more. They recruited agents in neutral countries to search for information about Mackindo and his methods. They interrogated every repatriated prisoner who'd been treated at Queen Victoria Hospital. They even attempted to infiltrate the hospital itself, sending an agent posing as a Swiss Red Cross observer. The agent was caught within days by MI5, but the attempt demonstrated how seriously the Germans took the threat. By early 1941, the German High Command had reached a disturbing conclusion. Britain possessed a medical capability that Germany could not match. This realization had profound psychological effects. If the British were superior in medicine, what else might they be superior in? If German science couldn't solve this problem, what did that say about the myth of Aryan supremacy? The impact on Luftwaffe morale was subtle but significant. Pilots knew that if they were shot down and captured by the British, they had a better chance of survival and recovery than if they bailed out over Germany and were treated by their own doctors. This knowledge created a perverse incentive structure. Some pilots, when faced with certain death, chose to bail out over England rather than attempt to limp home. German propaganda tried to counter this by claiming that the British treatment was experimental and dangerous, that it was only offered to prisoners who agreed to collaborate, that the success stories were exaggerated or fabricated. But the propaganda was undermined by the physical evidence: repatriated pilots with functional hands and working eyes, living proof that British medicine was saving lives that German medicine could not. In March 1941, a Luftwaffe intelligence report landed on the desk of General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch, Göring's deputy, and the man responsible for Luftwaffe logistics and personnel. The report was titled "Assessment of British Medical Capabilities in Burn Treatment," and its conclusions were stark. The enemy has developed a burn treatment protocol that results in survival rates approximately 60% higher than our own methods. Pilots treated by the British show minimal contracture, reduced infection rates, and preservation of sight in cases where blindness would normally be expected. Our attempts to replicate this treatment have failed. We must conclude that Britain possesses medical knowledge or resources that we currently lack. This represents a significant strategic disadvantage in the air war. Milch read the report 3 times, then locked it in his safe. The implications were too dangerous to share widely. If word spread that German medicine was inferior to British medicine, it would undermine the entire ideological foundation of the Nazi state. Better to keep it quiet, to continue the research in secret, and to hope that eventually German ingenuity would find a solution. But secrets have a way of spreading, especially in wartime. By the summer of 1941, every Luftwaffe pilot knew about the British miracle treatment. They knew about Mackindou and Queen Victoria Hospital. They knew that capture by the British might mean survival, while bailing out over Germany might mean death or permanent disability. And in the corridors of power in Berlin, a question was being asked with increasing urgency. If the British can do this with burn treatment, what else can they do that we don't know about? What other advantages do they possess? What other secrets are they keeping? The answer to those questions would prove even more disturbing than the Germans could imagine. Because Mackindou's burn treatment was just the beginning. The real weapon wasn't the salve itself, it was what the British were doing with the men they saved. By the spring of 1941, Ward III at Queen Victoria Hospital had become the most important medical facility in Britain that nobody was supposed to know about. The official designation was RAF Centre for Plastic and Jaw Surgery, a bureaucratic title that concealed the revolutionary work happening within its walls. To the patients, it was simply the Guinea Pig Club, a name that reflected both their status as experimental subjects and their determination to face their ordeal with characteristic British humour. Archibald Mackindou's burn treatment had proven its worth beyond any doubt. Of the 127 severely burned RAF pilots treated with his saline and salve method between October 1940 and March 1941, 114 had survived, a survival rate of nearly 90% compared to the 30% survival rate under tannic acid treatment. More remarkably, 67 of those survivors had retained enough function in their hands and eyes to potentially return to active duty. It was a medical miracle by any standard, but success brought new challenges. As word of Mackindou's results spread through the RAF, Queen Victoria Hospital was inundated with burn cases. The small ward that had been designed for 20 patients now held over 60, with more arriving daily. The hospital's pharmacy was struggling to produce enough salve to meet demand. And Mackindou himself was working 18-hour days, performing reconstructive surgeries, training other surgeons in his methods, and managing the psychological care of men whose faces had been destroyed. Then, on the night of April 10, 1941, everything nearly came crashing down. The Luftwaffe had largely abandoned its strategic bombing campaign against Britain after the failure of the Blitz, but sporadic raids continued. That night, A formation of Heinkel He 111 bombers, lost and low on fuel, jettisoned their bomb loads over East Grinstead. One 250-kilogram bomb struck the east wing of Queen Victoria Hospital at 11:47 p.m. The explosion tore through the building's tuberculosis ward, mercifully empty since its conversion to storage, and sent a shockwave through the entire structure. Windows shattered, walls cracked. The electrical system failed, plunging the hospital into darkness. And in Ward the Third, 60 burned and bandaged men began to scream. Mackindo was in his office when the bomb hit. The blast threw him across the room, slamming him into a bookshelf. He staggered to his feet, ears ringing, and ran toward Ward the Third, through corridors filled with smoke and dust. "Sister Hall!" he shouted. "Sister Hall, report!" "Here, sir!" Her voice came from the darkness ahead. "Ward 3 is intact, but we've lost power. The patients are panicking." Mackindo pushed through the door into Ward 3. Emergency lanterns were being lit, casting flickering shadows across rows of beds. The patients, men with bandaged faces, men with hands wrapped in gauze, men whose bodies were still healing from burns, were sitting up, calling out, some trying to climb out of bed despite their injuries. "Everyone stay calm!" Mackindo's voice cut through the chaos. "The building is structurally sound. You're safe. Nurses, check every patient. I want a full casualty report in 5 minutes." He moved through the ward, touching shoulders, speaking quietly to the men who were most distressed. Many of them had been shot down in flames. The bomb blast had triggered traumatic memories of their aircraft exploding around them. Mackindo understood. He'd seen enough psychological trauma to know that these men's wounds went deeper than their burned skin. "Dr. Mackindo!" One of the junior nurses appeared at his elbow, her face pale in the lantern light. "Sir, the pharmacy took a direct hit. It's gone. Everything's gone." Mackindo felt his stomach drop. The pharmacy. The salve. They'd had enough stockpiled for perhaps 3 days of treatment. After that, "How much salve do we have in the ward?" he asked, keeping his voice level. Sister Hall appeared with a clipboard. "We did inventory last night, sir. We have enough for approximately 48 hours at current usage rates. After that, we'll need to ration or find an alternative source. 48 hours. 2 days to find a solution, or his patients would be forced back onto tannic acid treatment, a death sentence for many of them." "Get me a telephone line to London," Mackindo said. "I need to speak to the Ministry of Health, and send runners to every pharmacy within 20 miles. I want to know what supplies they have available. Petroleum jelly, cod liver oil, sulfonamide powder, anything we can use." The next 48 hours were a blur of desperate improvisation. Mackindo contacted every pharmaceutical company in southern England, begging, demanding, and occasionally threatening to get the raw materials he needed. The Ministry of Health, initially bureaucratic and unhelpful, was bypassed when Mackindo went directly to Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production, who understood that saving pilots was as important as building aircraft. "How much do you need?" Beaverbrook asked over a crackling telephone line. "Enough to treat 60 patients twice daily indefinitely," Mackindo replied. "And enough to stockpile against future disruptions. We can't let this happen again." "You'll have it," Beaverbrook said. "I'll requisition it under emergency war powers. But Archie, this treatment of yours, it works?" "It works." "Then we need to scale it up. Every RAF hospital should have access to it. Every burn case should be treated with your method. Can you train other surgeons?" Mackindo hesitated. Training other surgeons meant sharing his techniques, documenting his methods, creating a standardized protocol. It meant giving up control, but it also meant saving more lives. "Yes," he said, "I can train them." Within 72 hours, emergency supplies of petroleum jelly, cod liver oil, and sulfonamide powder arrived at Queen Victoria Hospital by military convoy. The hospital's makeshift pharmacy, set up in a converted storage room, began producing salve around the clock. Crisis averted. But the bombing had exposed a deeper vulnerability. Queen Victoria Hospital was a single point of failure. If another bomb hit, if the facility was destroyed, the knowledge and expertise concentrated there would be lost. Mackindo needed to decentralize, to spread his methods across the entire RAF medical system. He began training other surgeons in May 1941. The first class consisted of 12 RAF medical officers, selected for their skill and their willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. Mackindo taught them everything: the salve composition, the saline bath technique, the importance of keeping wounds moist and flexible, the psychological care that was as important as the physical treatment. "Gentlemen," he told them on the first day of training, "you're going to see things that will haunt you for the rest of your lives. You're going to treat boys," and they are boys, most of them barely 20 years old, whose faces have been burned away, whose hands are charred stumps, who are blind or going blind, or wish they were blind so they wouldn't have to see what they've become. Your job is to save them, not just their bodies, but their minds and their spirits, because a pilot who survives but loses his will to live is just as dead as one who doesn't survive at all. He showed them photographs, before and after images of patients treated with his method. The transformations were remarkable, but Mackindo was careful to emphasize that the results weren't magic. They were the product of meticulous care, constant attention, and a willingness to innovate when standard methods failed. "The Germans are trying to figure out what we're doing," Mackindo continued. "They've repatriated prisoners, examined them, studied their medical records. They're desperate to replicate our results, but they're failing. And do you know why? Because they're still thinking in terms of doctrine and protocol. They're trying to find a formula, a recipe they can follow mechanically. But medicine isn't mechanical, it's adaptive. Every patient is different. Every burn is unique. You have to think, to observe, to adjust. That's what the Germans can't do. That's our advantage." The training program was intense: 6 weeks of classroom instruction, surgical observation, and hands-on practice. By July 1941, the first cohort of Mackindo-trained surgeons was deployed to RAF hospitals across Britain. By the end of the year, over 50 surgeons had been trained, and the survival rate for RAF burn cases had climbed to over 85% across the entire medical system. But Mackindo's most important innovation wasn't medical, it was psychological. He understood that burned pilots faced not just physical recovery, but social reintegration. Their faces were disfigured, their hands scarred. They feared rejection by their families, their communities, their country. Many became depressed, withdrawn, suicidal. Mackindo's solution was radical. He opened the hospital to the town. He encouraged the people of East Grinstead to visit Ward III, to meet the patients, to see past the scars and bandages to the men beneath. He arranged for local pubs to welcome the guinea pigs, for shops to serve them without staring, for the community to embrace them as heroes rather than monsters. The town responded magnificently. The Whitehall restaurant became an unofficial gathering place for the guinea pigs, where they could drink beer and socialize without fear of judgment. Local families invited patients to Sunday dinners. Children were taught not to stare or point, but to smile and say hello. East Grinstead became known as the town that didn't stare, a place where burned men could walk the streets with dignity. This social rehabilitation was as important as the medical treatment. Patients who had been suicidal began to hope again. Men who had hidden their faces began to venture out. The psychological wounds began to heal alongside the physical ones. And then, in August 1941, Mackindo received a visitor who would change everything. Major Thomas Kendrick of MI6 arrived at Queen Victoria Hospital on a grey Tuesday afternoon, carrying a briefcase and wearing the same mild expression that concealed his sharp intelligence. He found Mackindo in the operating theatre, performing a skin graft on a pilot whose nose had been burned away. "I need to speak with you," Kendrick said. "Privately. It's a matter of national security." They met in Mackindo's office after the surgery. Kendrick opened his briefcase and removed a file marked "Most Secret." You remember Franz Bergmann? Kendrick asked. Of course, the Luftwaffe pilot, my first success case. He's become something of a legend in Germany, Kendrick said. The pilot who was saved by British medicine. The Germans have been studying him, trying to understand what we did. They're failing, which is good for us, but I think we can do better than just keeping them confused. I think we can use your work as a weapon. McIndoe frowned. My work saves lives. I'm not interested in turning it into a weapon. You already have, Kendrick replied. Every German pilot who knows about your treatment, every Luftwaffe officer who's seen the repatriated prisoners, every doctor who's tried and failed to replicate your results, they're all affected. They're demoralized. They're questioning their own capabilities. They're starting to believe that Britain is superior in ways they can't match. That's psychological warfare, Dr. McIndoe, and it's devastatingly effective. He leaned forward. I want to amplify it. I want to make sure every German pilot knows that if they're shot down over Britain, they'll receive the best medical care in the world, better than what they'd get from their own side. I want them to know that we'll save their hands, their eyes, their faces. I want them to know that we're more humane, more advanced, more civilized than the regime they're fighting for. You want me to treat German prisoners, McIndoe said slowly. I want you to save them, Kendrick corrected, just as you'd save British pilots. And then I want you to send them home, healed and whole, as living proof of British superiority. Can you imagine the effect? German pilots returning from captivity with functional hands and working eyes, telling stories of the miracle treatment they received from the enemy. It will undermine German morale more effectively than any bombing raid. McIndoe was silent for a long moment. The proposal was ethically complex. Using medical care as propaganda, as a weapon of psychological warfare, it felt like a violation of the Hippocratic Oath. And yet wasn't saving lives always the right thing to do, regardless of nationality? Wasn't showing mercy to the enemy a demonstration of the values Britain was fighting to preserve? I'll do it, McIndoe said finally, but on one condition. Every German prisoner I treat receives exactly the same care as every British pilot. No exceptions. No special treatment, no withholding of care for propaganda purposes. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it as a doctor, not as a spy. Kendrick smiled. Dr. McIndoe, that's exactly what makes it so effective. The fact that you treat them as human beings, not as enemies. That's the weapon. That's what the Germans can't understand and can't counter. Your humanity is more powerful than any bomb we could drop. And so began the most unusual aspect of McIndoe's work, the treatment of enemy pilots with the same revolutionary care that was saving British lives. Over the next 3 years, over 40 German pilots would pass through Ward Thur, each one receiving the same meticulous treatment, the same psychological support, the same social rehabilitation as their British counterparts. And each one, when repatriated, would carry back to Germany a story that would haunt the Luftwaffe for the rest of the war. The crisis of the bombing had forced innovation. The innovation had led to expansion, and the expansion had transformed McIndoe's medical breakthrough into something larger, a demonstration of British values, British ingenuity, and British humanity that would prove more demoralizing to the enemy than any military defeat. By the autumn of 1943, the air war over Europe had entered a new and brutal phase. The RAF's Bomber Command, joined by the American 8th Air Force, was conducting round-the-clock strategic bombing of German industrial targets. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, was fighting a desperate defensive battle against overwhelming Allied air superiority. And in the hospitals and medical facilities on both sides of the conflict, the burn wards were overflowing. At Queen Victoria Hospital, Archibald McIndoe's Guinea Pig Club had grown to over 600 members, RAF pilots, bomber crew, and even some American airmen who'd been transferred to East Grinstead for treatment. The survival rate for severe burns had stabilized at 89%, a figure that would have been considered impossible just 3 years earlier. More remarkably, over 40% of treated patients were returning to active duty. Men who would have been medically discharged under the old tannic acid protocol were flying combat missions again, their hands functional, their eyes working, their faces rebuilt through Mackindow's pioneering reconstructive surgery. The impact on RAF operational capability was profound. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of Bomber Command, wrote to Mackindow in November 1943, "Your work has returned more pilots to combat duty than our entire training program has produced in the same period. You are, quite literally, multiplying our fighting strength. The debt the RAF owes you cannot be calculated." But the impact on German morale was even more significant and far more insidious. In Berlin, the Luftwaffe Medical Corps was still struggling to replicate British burn treatment results. Despite 3 years of research, despite interrogating dozens of repatriated prisoners, despite analyzing captured medical supplies, they had failed to achieve anything close to Mackindow's success rates. German burn patients continued to die at rates approaching 60%. Those who survived were often permanently disabled, their hands contracted into useless claws, their faces frozen in masks of scar tissue, their eyes blinded by corneal damage. The psychological effect on Luftwaffe pilots was devastating. They knew, everyone knew, that capture by the British meant a chance at survival and recovery, while bailing out over Germany meant probable death or permanent disability. This knowledge created a perverse incentive structure that German commanders could neither acknowledge nor address. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe fighter ace with 176 confirmed kills, wrote in his private diary in December 1943, "Our boys are more afraid of being shot down over the Reich than over England. They know the British will save them. They know our own doctors will let them die. How did it come to this? How did we lose the moral high ground to the enemy? The answer was walking through the streets of German cities, visible to anyone who cared to look. Repatriated prisoners, their faces rebuilt by British surgeons, their hands functional, their eyes working. They were living advertisements for British medical superiority, and their presence was corrosive to German morale. Hauptmann Klaus Müller was one such advertisement. Shot down over the North Sea in July 1942, he'd been rescued by a British destroyer and taken to Queen Victoria Hospital with burns covering 45% of his body. Mackindow had treated him for 8 months, saline baths, the miracle salve, multiple reconstructive surgeries. When Müller was repatriated in March 1943, his hands were functional enough to write, his face was recognizably human, and his eyes were intact. He was examined by Dr. Friedrich Hesse, the same Luftwaffe physician who'd examined Franz Bergmann 3 years earlier. Hesse's report to the Luftwaffe High Command was blunt. "The British have achieved results that we cannot match. Hauptmann Müller's recovery is medically remarkable. His hands retain 70% functionality. His facial reconstruction is excellent. His eyes show no signs of corneal damage, despite complete loss of eyelids in the initial injury. Our own treatment protocols would have resulted in permanent disability or death. We must conclude that British burn medicine is significantly superior to our own, and we have no prospect of closing this gap with current resources and knowledge." The report was classified most secret and locked away, but Müller himself was not so easily hidden. He was reassigned to a training unit where he told his story to every young pilot who would listen. The British had saved him. The British had rebuilt his face. The British had given him back his life, and the unspoken corollary was clear. His own side would not have done the same. The stories multiplied. By late 1943, over 30 repatriated Luftwaffe pilots were circulating through the German military system, each one a walking testament to British medical superiority. The Nazi propaganda machine tried to counter the narrative, claiming the British treatment was experimental and dangerous, that it was only offered to collaborators, that the success stories were exaggerated. But the propaganda was undermined by physical evidence. The men were real, their recovery was real, and their gratitude to their former captors was disturbingly genuine. In November 1943, the situation reached a crisis point. A Luftwaffe pilot named Lieutenant Hans Schreiber, shot down over Hamburg during an RAF raid, deliberately steered his damaged aircraft toward the North Sea rather than attempting to bail out over land. He was rescued by a British air-sea rescue launch and taken to Queen Victoria Hospital. Under interrogation, he admitted that he'd chosen to ditch in the sea specifically to ensure capture by the British. "I knew if I bailed out over Hamburg, I'd be taken to a German hospital," Schreiber told his MI6 interrogators. "I've seen what happens to burned pilots in German hospitals. They die, or they wish they were dead. I chose to take my chances with you." The interrogation report reached Winston Churchill's desk within days. The Prime Minister, always attuned to the psychological dimensions of warfare, immediately grasped the significance. He summoned Archibald Macindoe to 10 Downing Street. They met in Churchill's study on a cold December evening. The Prime Minister was in his siren suit, a cigar clamped between his teeth, his bulldog face creased with fatigue. The war was turning in Britain's favour, but victory was still distant and uncertain. "Dr. Macindoe," Churchill said, waving him to a chair, "I've been reading about your work. Remarkable, truly remarkable. You've saved hundreds of our boys, given them back their lives, their faces, their futures. The nation owes you a debt that can never be repaid." "I'm just doing my job, Prime Minister," Macindoe replied. "Nonsense. You're doing far more than your job. You're winning the war." Churchill leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Do you know what the intelligence services are telling me? They're telling me that German pilots are deliberately getting themselves captured so they can receive British medical treatment. They're telling me that Luftwaffe morale is collapsing because their own doctors can't save them. They're telling me that your hospital, your work, is more effective at undermining German fighting spirit than all the bombs we're dropping on Berlin." He paused, letting the words sink in. "That's psychological warfare of the highest order, Doctor, and the beauty of it is that you're not doing anything wrong. You're not torturing prisoners or spreading propaganda. You're simply being a good doctor. You're showing mercy, demonstrating skill, and proving that British civilization is superior to Nazi barbarism. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant." Macindoe shifted uncomfortably. "Prime Minister, I don't treat patients to undermine enemy morale. I treat them because they're human beings who need help." "I know," Churchill said. "That's what makes it so effective. Your humanity is our weapon. Your compassion is our strategy. The Germans can't counter it because to counter it, they'd have to become more humane than us. And they can't do that without undermining everything their regime stands for." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the darkened city. "I want you to continue your work, Dr. Macindoe. Treat every patient, British, American, German, it doesn't matter, with the same skill and compassion you've shown so far. Save as many lives as you can. And know that every life you save, every face you rebuild, every hand you restore to function, it's a blow against tyranny. It's a demonstration of what we're fighting for. It's proof that our way of life is worth preserving." Macindoe left Downing Street with a strange mixture of pride and unease. He'd never thought of his work in strategic terms, never considered that mercy could be a weapon. But Churchill was right. Every German pilot who returned home, healed and whole, was a living refutation of Nazi ideology. Every story of British compassion undermined the propaganda of British cruelty. Every successful treatment demonstrated that British science, British medicine, British humanity were superior to anything the Third Reich could offer. The impact accelerated through 1944. As the Allied invasion of Europe approached, as the air war intensified, as more and more German pilots were shot down and captured, the flow of repatriated prisoners increased. Each one carried back the same story. Each one showed the same remarkable recovery. and each one contributed to the growing sense within the Luftwaffe that they were fighting a losing battle, not just militarily, but morally and scientifically. By D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, the psychological warfare effect of Mackindow's work had become a recognized factor in Allied intelligence assessments. A Joint Intelligence Committee report from July 1944 stated, "German aircrew morale has been significantly affected by the knowledge that British medical treatment for burns is superior to their own. This has contributed to a measurable increase in surrender rates among Luftwaffe personnel and a corresponding decrease in fighting effectiveness. The medical treatment provided at Queen Victoria Hospital and similar facilities should be considered a strategic asset in the ongoing air campaign." The Germans, for their part, never found a solution. Despite 4 years of research, despite the resources of the entire Reich medical establishment, despite interrogating dozens of repatriated prisoners and analyzing captured supplies, they never replicated Mackindow's results. The reasons were complex, partly technical. They never quite got the salve composition right, partly philosophical. They couldn't abandon the rigid doctrine of tannic acid treatment, and partly ideological. The Nazi emphasis on racial superiority made it difficult to admit that British medicine was better. But the ultimate reason was simpler. Mackindow's treatment worked not just because of the salve, but because of the entire system he'd created. The psychological care, the social rehabilitation, the community support, the emphasis on treating patients as human beings rather than as damaged equipment. That system was built on values of compassion, flexibility, and human dignity that were fundamentally incompatible with Nazi ideology. The Germans couldn't replicate it without ceasing to be Nazis. And so the war continued, with British and American pilots knowing that if they were burned, they would be saved, while German pilots knew that if they were burned, they would likely die or be permanently disabled. That knowledge affected every decision, every risk calculation, every moment of combat. It was an invisible advantage, impossible to quantify, but undeniably real. In the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces pushed across France and into Germany itself, Archibald Mackindow received a letter from an unexpected source. It was from Dr. Friedrich Hesse, the Luftwaffe physician who'd been trying for 4 years to understand British burn treatment. The letter had been smuggled out through neutral Sweden. "Dear Dr. Mackindow," it read, "I write to you as one physician to another, setting aside the enmity of our nations. I have studied your work for 4 years. I've examined dozens of patients you have treated. I've attempted to replicate your methods. I have failed. I write now not to ask for your secrets. I know you cannot share them while the war continues, but simply to acknowledge that you have achieved something remarkable. You have advanced the science of medicine in ways that will benefit humanity long after this war is forgotten. When peace comes, if I survive, I hope to meet you and learn from you. Until then, I salute you as a colleague and as a healer. Yours in medicine, Dr. Friedrich Hesse." Mackindow read the letter 3 times, then filed it away carefully. He would meet Hesse after the war, would share his techniques freely, would help rebuild German medical capabilities. But that was for the future. For now, there was work to do. There were lives to save. There were faces to rebuild. There were young men, British, American, German, it didn't matter, who needed his help. And in providing that help, in showing mercy to friend and enemy alike, Archibald Mackindow was proving that the values Britain fought for, compassion, humanity, the dignity of every individual, were not just ideals, but practical weapons that could win wars. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, VE Day. Across Britain, people poured into the streets in celebration, dancing, singing, embracing strangers, releasing 4 years of pent-up fear and exhaustion in an explosion of joy. In London, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, chanting for the King and Queen. In every town and village, church bells rang for the first time since 1940, their peals echoing across a landscape scarred by war, but unbroken in spirit. In East Grinstead, the celebration was more subdued, but no less heartfelt. The town that had become known as the town that didn't stare gathered in the market square, and among the crowd were dozens of men whose faces bore the marks of fire, the guinea pigs of Ward III, the survivors of Archibald McIndoe's revolutionary treatment. They stood alongside the townspeople who had welcomed them, supported them, and helped them rebuild not just their bodies, but their lives. McIndoe himself was not in the square. He was in Ward III, as he had been almost every day for the past 5 years, performing one final surgery on a young pilot who'd been burned in the last week of the war. The boy, he was only 19, had been shot down over Bremen on May 2nd, just days before the German surrender. His face was badly burned, his hands damaged, his future uncertain. But McIndoe was determined that this last casualty of the air war would receive the same care, the same skill, the same chance at recovery as all the others. "Will I be all right, sir?" the boy asked as the anesthetic began to take effect. "You'll be fine," McIndoe assured him. "We'll fix you up. You'll have scars, but you'll have a life, a good life. I promise you that." It was a promise he'd made to over 600 patients during the war, and he'd kept it more often than not. The final statistics were remarkable. Of the 649 severely burned RAF and Allied aircrew treated at Queen Victoria Hospital between 1940 and 1945, 579 survived, an 89% survival rate. Of those survivors, 267 returned to active duty during the war, and another 198 were able to resume normal civilian lives after the war. Only 114 remained permanently disabled, and even they had been given far more function and quality of life than would have been possible under the old tannic acid treatment. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real legacy of McIndoe's work lay in what happened after the war, in the decades that followed, in the lives that were lived, and the futures that were possible. Because of what he had achieved, the Guinea Pig Club continued after the war, transforming from a hospital ward into a social organization. The members, eventually numbering 649, one for each patient treated at Queen Victoria Hospital, met annually for reunions, supported each other through the challenges of post-war life, and maintained the bonds forged in Ward III. They became a living testament to the power of medical innovation and human compassion. Many of the guinea pigs went on to remarkable post-war careers. Richard Hillary, one of McIndoe's early patients, wrote The Last Enemy, a memoir that became one of the defining accounts of the Battle of Britain. Geoffrey Page became a successful businessman and tireless advocate for burn victims. Tom Gleave rose to the rank of group captain in the RAF and later worked in civil aviation. Bill Foxley became a renowned artist, painting with hands that doctors had said would never function again. Their success was not just personal. It was a validation of McIndoe's philosophy that burned men could be fully reintegrated into society if given proper medical care and social support. The town that didn't stare had proven that disfigurement need not mean isolation, that scars need not define a person's worth, that compassion and acceptance could heal wounds that surgery alone could not reach. McIndoe himself continued his work after the war, but the focus shifted from emergency treatment to long-term reconstruction. Many of his wartime patients required multiple surgeries over years or even decades to fully restore function and appearance. McIndoe performed thousands of these procedures, refining his techniques, training new generations of plastic surgeons, and establishing the principles that would guide reconstructive surgery for the rest of the century. In 1946, he was knighted for his services to medicine, becoming Sir Archibald McIndoe. The honor was richly deserved, but McIndoe characteristically deflected the credit to his team, the nurses, the anaesthetists, the physiotherapists, the townspeople of East Grinstead, who had all contributed to the success of Ward III. "I didn't do this alone," he said in his acceptance speech. Every patient who survived, every face that was rebuilt, every hand that was restored. It was the work of hundreds of people, all of them dedicated to the simple principle that every human being deserves the best care we can provide, regardless of who they are or where they come from. That's the real achievement. That's what we should celebrate. The medical legacy of McIndoe's work was profound and lasting. His burn treatment protocol, saline baths, petroleum-based salve, moist wound healing, early skin grafting, and comprehensive psychological care became the global standard. The tannic acid treatment that had killed so many in the early years of the war was abandoned entirely. Medical schools around the world taught McIndoe's methods. Burn units were established in hospitals across Britain and beyond, staffed by surgeons he had trained or who had learned from his publications. The impact extended far beyond military medicine. Civilian burn victims, children scalded by boiling water, workers injured in industrial accidents, victims of house fires, all benefited from the techniques McIndoe had developed. The survival rate for severe burns in civilian populations increased dramatically in the post-war decades, and much of that improvement could be traced directly to the innovations pioneered in Ward 3. But perhaps the most important legacy was philosophical rather than technical. McIndoe had demonstrated that medicine at its best was not just about treating disease or repairing injury, it was about restoring the whole person, body and mind and spirit, to a full and meaningful life. This holistic approach, revolutionary in the 1940s, became a cornerstone of modern medical practice. The psychological care that McIndoe had insisted upon, treating patients as individuals, involving them in their own treatment decisions, addressing their emotional and social needs alongside their physical injuries, anticipated by decades the patient-centered care movement that would transform medicine in the late 20th century. The social rehabilitation program he'd pioneered in East Grinstead became a model for community-based recovery programs around the world. And the ethical principle that had guided his treatment of German prisoners, that medical care should be provided based on need, not nationality or ideology, became enshrined in international humanitarian law through the Geneva Conventions and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1960, McIndoe received a letter from Dr. Friedrich Hesse, the Luftwaffe physician who had spent the war years trying to understand British burn treatment. Hesse had survived the war, had been briefly imprisoned by the Allies, and had then worked to rebuild German medical capabilities in the post-war years. He had finally achieved results comparable to McIndoe's, using techniques he'd learned from British medical journals and from visiting Queen Victoria Hospital in 1952. "Dear Sir Archibald," the letter read, "20 years ago I wrote to you as an enemy, acknowledging that you had achieved something I could not. Today I write as a colleague and, I hope, a friend. I've spent the past 15 years implementing your methods in German hospitals. The results have been transformative. We are now saving lives that would have been lost, restoring function that would have been destroyed. But more than that, we are treating our patients with the dignity and compassion that you demonstrated even to your enemies during the war. That lesson, that every patient deserves our best efforts, regardless of who they are, is perhaps your greatest contribution to medicine. Thank you for teaching it to us, even when we were trying to kill you. With deepest respect and gratitude, Friedrich Hesse." McIndoe kept that letter on his desk for the rest of his life. It represented in a way the ultimate validation of his work. Not just that his techniques were effective, but that the values underlying them had transcended the hatred and violence of war to become universal principles of medical practice. Archibald McIndoe died on April 11, 1960, at the age of 59, from a heart attack. His death was mourned across Britain and around the world. The Guinea Pig Club held a memorial service at which dozens of men whose lives he had saved stood to testify to his skill, his compassion, and his humanity. The RAF sent a guard of honor. The Royal College of Surgeons dedicated a memorial lecture in his name. And in East Grinstead, The town that had become synonymous with his work, a statue was erected, showing Mackindou with his hand on the shoulder of a burned airman, a permanent reminder of the bond between healer and patient that had defined his career. But the true memorial to Archibald Mackindou was not made of bronze or stone. It was made of living flesh, the faces he had rebuilt, the hands he had restored, the lives he had saved. It was the thousands of burn victims, military and civilian, who survived and thrived because of the techniques he had pioneered. It was the generations of plastic surgeons who learned from his example and carried his methods forward. It was the principle, now universally accepted, that medical care should be guided by compassion and skill rather than by prejudice or ideology. In the decades after his death, as the world moved further from the war years, the specific details of Mackindou's work faded from public memory. The Guinea Pig Club continued to meet, but their numbers dwindled as age took its inevitable toll. The last surviving member, squadron leader John Hoppy Hopkinson, died in 2013 at the age of 92. With his passing, the direct link to Ward III was broken, but the legacy endured. In hospitals around the world, burn victims received care based on principles Mackindou had established. In medical schools, students learned techniques he had pioneered. In East Grinstead, the Queen Victoria Hospital continued its work, still specializing in reconstructive surgery, still carrying forward the mission that Mackindou had begun in the desperate summer of 1940. And in the archives of the Royal College of Surgeons, in the records of the RAF Medical Services, in the memoirs and letters and photographs preserved by the families of the guinea pigs, the story remained. A story of innovation born from necessity, of compassion shown to friend and enemy alike, of one man's determination to save lives and restore hope in the darkest days of Britain's history. It was a story that demonstrated a fundamental truth about war and humanity, that even in the midst of violence and hatred, even when nations are locked in mortal combat, the impulse to heal, to help, to show mercy can survive and even flourish. That the values of civilization, compassion, skill, dedication to human dignity are not luxuries to be abandoned in wartime, but weapons more powerful than any bomb or bullet. Archibald Mackindou understood this instinctively. He knew that every life he saved, every face he rebuilt, every hand he restored was not just a medical achievement, but a moral victory. A demonstration that British values were worth fighting for because they were worth living by, even toward those who sought to destroy them. In the end, that was his greatest contribution. Not just the techniques he developed or the lives he saved, but the example he set, an example of what medicine could be, what humanity could be, what Britain could be at its best. An example that inspired generations of doctors, transformed the practice of medicine, and proved that compassion and skill, applied with determination and courage, could change the world. As Winston Churchill had recognized in that meeting in 1943, Mackindou's humanity was a weapon. But it was a weapon that healed rather than destroyed, that built rather than tore down, that created hope rather than spreading despair. It was the kind of weapon that wins not just wars, but the peace that follows, not just battles, but the struggle for the soul of civilization itself. And that legacy, that example, endures. In every burn unit, in every reconstructive surgery, in every act of medical compassion shown to those in need regardless of who they are or where they come from, the spirit of Archibald Mackindou and Ward III lives on. The guinea pigs may be gone, but what they represented, the triumph of humanity over hatred, of healing over harm, of hope over despair, remains as relevant and as necessary today as it was in the summer of 1940, when a New Zealand surgeon in a small English town decided to try something new, something radical, something that would change medicine forever. That is the legacy. That is the story. That is what we must remember. If you've been moved by this remarkable tale of British ingenuity, compassion, and determination, of how one man's refusal to accept conventional wisdom saved hundreds of lives and changed medicine forever, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. What other untold stories of the Second World War would you like us to explore? What other examples of British innovation and humanity during the darkest days should be brought to light? Join our community of history enthusiasts and help us preserve these extraordinary stories for future generations. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and let's continue this journey through history together.